It's my very great pleasure today to introduce my friend, colleague, Dr. Greg Sadler. Greg, you'll need to fill in some of the gaps, but you received your doctorate at
Southern
Illinois University. Yeah. He's published extensively in Ensemble and in philosophy of religion, and he's made a name for himself in two areas especially. One actually in three areas, and you can add to them if I'm skipping some. One is that he is one of the leaders in using philosophy in regard to counseling and in regard to corporate management and in regard to corporate ethics. He does extensive consultation in that respect. So we always tell our graduate students, you can, in fact, make a living in the real world with a philosophy PhD, and in fact, Greg is a stellar example of that. Number two, he is one of the leading lights in bringing Stoicism into discourse today. Ever since Admiral Stockdale talked about how the study of Epictetus helped him as a prisoner of war in Vietnam, people have been realizing that Stoicism is not just a word for what you do when you're sitting in the dentist chair, but it actually is a way of living and can have a lot to tell us today about living and dealing with adversity and living a good life. And so by means of the Stoicon and various online publications, Greg has been a leader in bringing people together in that way. And lastly, if you go to YouTube and Google nearly any philosopher, you will find somebody here who gives a little lecture and then maybe has 20 hits. And maybe you'll find a philosopher who's written some publications, giving a talk, and maybe that person gets 50 hits. And then you'll find Greg Sadler, and his talks on YouTube get thousands and thousands and thousands of hits. Why? Well, if you watch them, you'll see why. He is a master teacher and a very profound thinker. And so he is attracting renown and fame in that respect as well. We're very, very lucky that he's living in Milwaukee now and that he does some teaching for us and that he is part of our community of those here in Milwaukee that are interested in ancient philosophy. So please fill in your CV if I've missed any key points. But I'm very, very happy to introduce today Dr. Greg Sadler, who's going to be speaking about virtue without the mean.
Oh, and that was probably one of the nicest introductions that I've had. So that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I should mention that I'm not actually a Stoic as such. I'm like a Ciceronian eclectic, but I do a lot of things with Stoicism. And this particular set of topics that I'm working on with a friend and colleague of mine, Harold Kavli. I almost called him Harold Oslo. He's in Oslo, and he's a graduate student. We're both very interested in ancient philosophy and the notion of the will and, virtue ethics and stuff like that. And so we're thinking this is going to turn into a publication eventually. And I'm kind of looking for the stuff that doesn't make sense. So, if you have questions and you're like, yeah, I don't get that, that's perfect. That's exactly that's the kind of feedback we're looking for. What I've got here is kind of a excursus through the history of ancient philosophy. And it's rooted in something contemporary. As Owen was saying, there is a lot of contemporary interest in Stoicism today. It's been going on. You could say there's like a kind of renaissance that's been happening for the last, 40, 50 years in academia and in more popular venues. You could say maybe 20 years or so, 15 years or so. And so, like Stoicon is part of that, which is coming up soon, Stoic Week, all these more popularly oriented things. And, when we think about virtue ethics traditions in modernity, thank you. It's usually neo-Aristotelian stuff that we're looking at. To think about Alistair MacIntyre and the the massive influence that he's had since after virtue, and that's great. I think that's really awesome. But as Anthony Long points out in Greek Ethics After MacIntyre and the Stoic Community of Reason, Stoicism could actually provide a rival tradition to Aristotelianism. It has a lot of the same. It offers a lot of the same features that MacIntyre is highlighting. And MacIntyre also gets Stoicism wrong in After Virtue and in other things. And so Long, kind of takes him to task on that. So I think it's really worth giving some close and studious attention to classic Stoic virtue ethics if we want to try to use it in the present. And then when we do that, if we're not, just resting with popularized accounts or stuff like that, which are fine, they have their place, and we actually start going back to the text that we have, we find that there's aspects of Stoic virtue ethics that are perhaps less attractive. They're problematic. They're paradoxical. And we're like, what the hell's going on here? And so that's part of what we're going to be exploring here. I'm kind of conflicted about what to call this. I use the word official doctrine or official position as if there is one for ancient Stoicism. And it has some interesting features that make it quite a bit different than Aristotelian virtue ethics. If we think about what Aristotelian virtue ethics has, it's really centered around this notion of the mean, right? The mean between two different opposed vices, or sometimes four different opposed vices, like in the case of anger, 5 if you added the Eudemian ethics, and then 2 on the other side. But there's like a mean position, and it's a mean with respect to actions and with respect to passions or emotions and external goods and stuff like that. And when you look at the Stoic official position, it's not like that at all. And they actually say, no, the Aristotelians have it wrong. So I think that we can make an interesting examination of this. And I'd like to, suggest something that's coming out of these texts at the start. We should think about whether the Stoic position is just paradoxical, or as Cicero has Cato saying, startling truths, ad mirabilia, right? Or whether Plutarch is right, and the Stoics are caught up in actually self-contradictions, that their position ultimately doesn't make sense. The Latin for that is wonderful. It's de stoicorum repugnantius, right? So their doctrines are pushing each other away. They're repugnant to each other. So the plan that I had for this is to set out the official Stoic position, or the classic Stoic position on virtue and vice, and then look at some of the arguments that the Stoics actually provide, because they're really big on giving arguments, and then examine a few critics, some of the most important ones. And so that would be Cicero himself, who first presents the Stoic position in On the Ends, Book 3, in the mouth of Cato, one of the greatest Stoics, and then tries to demolish it in Book 4. Plutarch is a very prolific ancient Middle Platonist writer. He's got a number of different places where he's attacking the Stoics. Another person is, because we don't want to leave the Aristotelians out, Alexander of Aphrodisias. And I thought if we have the time, we'll also briefly look at the Handbook of Stoicism that we now think is Alcinous. For a while, there was some debate about who actually wrote that. And I do actually have a suggestion that we'll hopefully get to at the end, which is that maybe what we have to adopt if we want to hold on to this Stoic position is something like what Lawrence Becker in A New Stoicism, one of the very important early books in the Stoic Renaissance in the 20th century, argues for, which is he calls it a Posidonian Stoicism. And if you know who Posidonius is, he's somebody who the official or orthodox Stoics thought wasn't sufficiently Stoic, right? They attack him. Unfortunately, we don't have any of Posidonius's works. We just have fragments. But we also don't know anything about these official Stoics because they weren't as important as Posidonius. So where can we get the Stoic official orthodox position? We're a little bit handicapped, it'd be really great if, like, at these, Herculaneum site scrolls, if we find some things by Chrysippus or, Cleanthes, these things that we only know about from listings. But we do have 3 fairly systematic summaries of Stoic doctrine: Cicero in On the Ends, Book 3, Diogenes Laertes in Book 7, and Aristoteles' Epitome of Stoic Ethics, which you'll sometimes see referred to mistakenly as Stobaeus. It is found in Stobaeus' anthology, but it's just one of many texts in there. And it's important to point out, too, that none of these are actually Stoics. Cicero's not a Stoic, Aristoteles is not a Stoic, and Diogenes Laertes is, he's more attracted to Epicureanism than anything else. So what are the features of Stoic ethics? There's a lot of them, and I want to just mention a few that we're not going to talk about before talking about the ones that we will go into. So one of them is that virtue is understood as knowledge, episteme, but it's also understood as techne. That I think we can leave aside for the time being. It's a very interesting topic, but I don't think we have to worry about it. There's also this question of the unity of the virtues, also very important, but not that germane to this. It is good to point out that the Stoics recognize 4 cardinal virtues, very similar to the Epicureans, the Platonists, right? There's wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, and each of them is sort of like a bucket that contains a bunch of sub-virtues, right? So something like generosity could be under justice, as it is for Cicero. And then the Stoics themselves had this... there was nothing they wouldn't debate with each other. One of the debates that they had, which is very interesting, if you're virtuous and you gain virtue, can you lose it? Right? It's sort of like the debates that you see in Christianity, like once saved, always saved. The Stoics themselves were on different sides of that. So what are the features that we are interested in, the ones that pertain to virtue and means? The first is the idea that there's nothing good or bad between the good or the bad, just what the Stoics call indifferents. And so you could look at that as kind of like a mean, a middle thing between them, but it's not quite the same thing. The second makes it even stronger. For the orthodox Stoic position, there is no intermediary. There's no middle, there's no mean between virtue and vice. So that means that every single one of us is either virtuous or we're vicious. And from the Stoic perspective, I won't speak for any of you, but I would be vicious because I'm not completely virtuous. I'm not a sage, The third one is that virtues, unlike the Aristotelian position and the later Platonist position, because they're happy to pick up on this idea. As a matter of fact, Plutarch at one point will anachronistically attribute the doctrine of the mean to Socrates, pretty implausibly. The Stoics don't have the doctrine of the mean. Virtues are not middle positions between vices in respect to particular subject matters, particularly with respect to emotions, as we're going to see. And then the other thing that really clinches it is this doctrine that is so wild that it gets called the Stoic paradox. Goods and bads are equal, meaning everything that's good is equally good to any other thing that's good, and everything that's bad is equally bad. So what does that mean? If you're virtuous, you're exactly the same amount of virtue as somebody else who is virtuous, and you can't become more virtuous. So that's very different than, most virtue ethics that we think about. And you could say, well, if that's the case, then how the hell are we actually going to progress in virtue? And the Stoics say, well, you're not going to, or at least some of them do. So we should, I should mention, well, what is the good for the Stoics? Virtue and the virtues, that's the good, but that's not all that there is, because they also talk about what participates in virtue. So good actions participate in virtue, right? They're stemming from virtue. Good conditions, which include certain activities or propensities, those would be good. Good emotional states. The Stoics don't think that all emotion is bad. As a matter of fact, they had the eupathai, the good emotions, and they distinguished three main categories of those, which include a whole bunch of other ones. Friendship, harmony, those are good things. A friend is a good thing. Good use of or dealing with matters, chresis in Greek. And Cato is going to say, and this is Cicero putting it in his mouth, so we don't know, did Cato really think this? I mean, probably. All other philosophical systems in varying degrees, no doubt, but still all which reckon anything of which virtue is not an element, do not merely, as I hold, give us no assistance or support in becoming better people, but are actually corrupting to the character. That's the official Stoic position. So what does that mean about Aristotelians or Platonists? I mean, the Epicureans, everyone knows they're corrupting to the character. Everyone bashes the Epicureans. But even the other schools that are kind of close, they're bad too, because they've got the wrong conception of virtue. So if we look at the first feature, the Stoics recognize, and I give you a handout there about goods, bads, and indifference. Unlike the Platonists or Aristotelians or later Christian authors, think about Augustine, for example, there are no higher and lower goods for the Stoics. You have, if something's good, it's good, and that's it. And there's different words that are used in Greek, the kalon, in Latin, the honestum, right? This is the category of things that are intrinsically good, and that includes the virtues and these other things. Everything else is just indifferent. It has some value, but the Greek word for that, oxia, right? It has some sort of measure of value, but it's not the kind of value that gets you to bad or good. So some indifference can be preferred or rejected. So, for example, wealth is a preferred indifferent, poverty is a rejected indifferent. But no amount of money is ever going to make you virtuous. And no amount of poverty is going to make you vicious or miserable or bad or anything like that. So Diogenes Laertes says only the morally beautiful is good virtue, and whatever participates in virtue consists in this. Seneca will actually, in letter 74, say, Seneca is a little bit willing to use language of goods in ways that are pushing the Stoic thing. He says, the true goods are those which reason bestows, substantial and eternal, that cannot fall away, nor can they grow less or be diminished. Other things are goods according to opinion. So everything that, pleasure, right? Aristotelians would say pleasure is a good. That's only a good according to opinion, not a real good at all, just indifferent. And so the Stoics, they do think that the indifferents have value in relation to each other. So Diogenes of Babylon will say, money's good because you can use it to improve your health, but health is still an indifferent. It's not virtue or vice. And the Stoics thought that indifferents do matter. They reject what you could call an indifferentism. Being indifferent to the indifference is not always the way that you should behave. Virtue is going to work within the realm of the indifference, but none of those things ever cease to be indifference. So they are in between virtue and vice, but you should probably think of it as they're not on the same plane. Virtue and vice are up here, or you could put vice way to the hell down here if you want to, because it's bad. And then you've got this vast swath of things in between that we call these indifferents. And Seneca will say, this is in letter 82, nothing is glorious that does not involve indifference. Illness, pain, poverty, death, none of these are glorious in themselves, but nothing is glorious without them. Virtue meets and handles them. Each object takes on a splendor not its own when virtue is added to it. So virtue is the thing that's good, and then it applies to these indifferents. And interestingly, moral improvement, prokope in Greek, that is a preferred indifferent according to these sort of traditional summaries of Stoic doctrine. So that's our first feature, right? So we've got one key aspect. Then we go a little bit deeper. The second key feature, there's no intermediary between virtue and vice. This is clearly different than the Aristotelian or later Platonic or other perspectives. Every one of us, according to this this traditional way of looking at virtue is either virtuous or vicious. I can't speak for any of you. I'm vicious in that case because I'm not a sage. Arius Didymus says there's nothing in between. There's no metaxu. There's no in between in that case. And he says that it's the view of Zeno and his Stoic followers. There's two types, gene, of human beings. The good, the spudaion, right, is a term that you see in Aristotle a lot as well. And then the bad, the phalon. And you're either one or the other. That's it. There's no possibility. The good use the virtues throughout their life. The bad use, chrestai, the vices, or are used by them. And then Diogenes Laertes says between virtue and vice there's nothing intermediate, whereas according to the Peripatetics, there is. And what is this thing that Diogenes says is in between? Moral improvement. And that's a little bit different than the traditional presentation in Aristotle, right? We've got vicious people over here and virtuous people over here, and then, closer to the virtuous would be the self-controlled, the, people who have enkrateia, and then there's the people who lack or lose self-control, they have akrasia, and if you do that enough, you become vicious, right? There's like this whole area. The Stoic position, and Diogenes Laertes is saying, well, the thing that we need to think about is the in-between as moral improvement. And from the Stoic perspective, this perspective that we're looking at here, even if you're improving, you're vicious. So that's pretty different than the Aristotelian position. The third feature, virtues not being intermediate or mean states. There's a rejection of virtue here as a mean between vices of excess and deficiency, particularly when it comes to the emotions. The Stoics are very, very clear that the Aristotelians are wrong in construing virtue as what Hobbes will later call a mediocrity of the passions, right? In Leviathan, he's bashing the Aristotelians for a different reason, because he wants to sweep them off the carpet so he can do his thing. So in Seneca's On Anger, with respect to anger itself, and then in Cicero's Tusculan Disputations in books 3 and 4, where he's presenting the Stoic view on the emotions and largely endorsing it, maybe in a little less clear aspect in Cicero's On Duties, book 1, courage, winds up being a virtue that applies to the emotions in that book. The Stoics, or at least the presentation of the Stoics is, moderate emotions are still bad because they're passions. They're leading us astray. So Seneca will say in Letter 85, virtue alone possesses moderation. The evils that afflict the mind do not admit of moderation. Isn't that an interesting idea? You can't have the right amount of anger. You can't have the right amount of grief or fear or sadness or desire. And he says, if you give in to them, they increase and they lead to the vices. So there's a lot of emotional states that are just kind of pushed aside. In the Tusculan Disputations, in Book 3, Cicero says, all disturbance, perturbatio, is a movement of the soul either destitute of reason or contemptuous of reason or disobedient to reason. That's the key thing for the Stoics. This is why those emotions are problematic. And so, okay, we can buy that, right? What about the other things that, from an Aristotelian perspective, virtues apply to? Actions, praxis, right? Can't those be moderate? Or what about external goods, like our wealth, if we're going to be generous? So the virtues do apply to the external goods for the Stoics, which we should use and pursue and value prudently, justly, courageously, and temperately. But it's not the same position as the Aristotelian point of view, in part because there's this heavy emphasis on doing things rationally, and also there's no in between the two different sets of vices. Now, that said, Seneca at times will talk as if courage is in between cowardice and foolhardiness. So that seems kind of Aristotelian, right? But for most of these other virtues, that's just not the case. You've got justice, you've got injustice, right? You've got wisdom, folly. You've got temperance or moderation, and then you've got intemperance. And there's no mention of a spectrum or something like that you would fall into. So the Stoics, are pretty clear about that. That's the third feature. Fourth feature, goods and bads are all equal to each other. So there is some controversy about this that we find in Diogenes Laertes, where he says that Chrysippus in Ethical Questions, Book 4, and Perseus and Zeno think that all wrong things, hamartima, in that are equal, but that Heraclides of Tarsus, who was a student of Antipater, who was one of the scholarchs, and Athenodorus both say, no, that's not the case. So there's already some in the early Stoa, there's some disagreement about this. But even by the time of Seneca, so we're talking about the late Roman Stoa, he says virtue admits of no stretching. It can't extend any further. Once you've got virtue, you've got virtue. Diogenes Laertes says that the Stoics think with justice and injustice there isn't a more just or more unjust, and likewise with the other virtues. So there isn't a more courageous and a less courageous. You either have courage or you don't. Seneca also says, he attributes this to Socrates. Socrates used to say that truth and virtue were the same. Just as truth does not grow, neither does virtue grow. So it has due proportions, and it is complete. Cicero has Cato tell us that virtue in harmony with reason and unbroken constancy is one. Nothing can be added to it to make it virtue in a greater degree. And nothing can be taken away, and the name of virtue still left to it. So this is pretty... we could multiply other citations, but I think you get the idea, right? There isn't any growth in virtue. That's all that you've got. Likewise, vice. If you're vicious, you're just vicious, and that's it. Now, the Stoics give some arguments about these matters, and I thought we could, briefly talk about some of those that may be interesting to come back to some of these. And you'll notice some familiar tropes coming up in them as you look through them. So when it comes to virtue and the indifferents, Cato says in Cicero's On the Ends, the light of a lamp is eclipsed and overpowered by the rays of the sun. A drop of honey is lost in the vastness of the Aegean Sea. An additional sixpence is nothing amidst the wealth of Creusus, or a single step in the journey from here to India. So those are, you get the idea there, right? You're not going to have any way of seeing it. If the Stoic definition of the ends of goods be accepted, it follows that all the value that you set on bodily advantages must be absolutely eclipsed and annihilated by the brilliance and majesty of virtue, right? So the idea there is you add anything to virtue, you're not going to notice any tangible difference because it's already as good as it's going to be. Seneca has a similar thing. Just as the supreme good does not admit of increase, exactly the happy life cannot be increased either, for it is not without the supreme good. Men do not understand that the happy life is a unit, for it's its essence and not its extent that establishes such a life on the noblest plane. Similar kind of idea there. As to nothing being in between virtue and vice, Diogenes Laertes again tells us that Chrysippus was presenting this. If one truth is not more true than another, neither is one falsehood more false than another. In the same way, one deceit is not more deceit than another, nor sin than sin. Right? So he's got three different classes of, I guess you could say, bads there. And they're all equally bad. And he brings up, he who is 100 furlongs from Canopus and he who's only 1 furlong is equally not in Canopus. So, if we're here in Milwaukee and we have to go to Waukesha, you drive down Wisconsin Avenue, you make it 10 blocks. Now, we would say you are closer to Waukesha. From the Stoic perspective, you could be at the off-ramp, to get on 164 or something like that. You're not in Waukesha yet. and it doesn't make any difference, right? Cicero has this other one, just as a drowning man is no more able to breathe if he be not far from the surface of the water, so that he might at any moment emerge, than if he were actually at the bottom. Just as a puppy on the point of opening its eyes is not less blind than one just born. Similarly, a person who's made some progress towards a state of virtue is nonetheless in misery than he who's made no progress at all. So, you can make progress if you want to, but it's not going to do you any good. You're still equally vicious. You're still just as bad. You're still just as miserable. Here's another one. I'm not going to go through all of these because I do want to have plenty of time for a discussion. But so, Cicero says On the Ends, just as supposing the merit of a shoe were to fit the foot, many shoes would not be superior to few shoes, or bigger shoes to smaller ones. I mean, in that case, they wouldn't fit, right? But he doesn't worry about that. So in the case of things, the good of which consists solely in propriety and opportuneness, a larger number of these things will not be rated higher than a smaller number, nor those lasting longer to those of a shorter duration. So these things that we can measure, they just don't matter to virtue, according to the Stoics. Seneca has, I'll just read one more from Seneca that I particularly like. Whether you draw a larger or smaller circle, its size affects its area, not its shape. One circle may remain as it is for a long time, while you may contract the other, or even merge it completely with the sand in which it was drawn, but each circle had the same shape. That which is straight is not judged by its size or number or duration. It can no more be made longer than it can be made shorter. Scale down the honorable life as much as you like from the full 100 years. Reduce it to a single day. It is equally honorable. Sometimes virtue is widespread, governing kingdoms, cities, and provinces, creating laws, developing friendships, regulating the duties that hold between relatives and children. So, you're a statesperson, you're doing all these cool things, right? At other times, it's limited by the narrow bounds of poverty, exile, or bereavement. Your life has shrunk down to a studio apartment that you never leave or something like that. And yet your virtue is exactly the same as that person who's living a large life, at least according to the Stoics. He says, virtue is just as great even when it's retreated into itself and is shut in on all sides. For its spirit is no less great and upright, its sagacity no less complete, its justice no less inflexible. There he's mentioning courage, magnanimity, wisdom and justice. He's using those as examples. So, this is, pretty coherent. Do we buy it? I mean, I don't. And I think a lot of other people would have a hard time with it. But that is the official Stoic position. And in antiquity, there were, a lot of people who are like, well, this clearly can't be right. Among them are people from other schools. So we have Cicero. Cicero isn't a Stoic. He's an eclectic. Officially, he belongs to the academic skeptic school, but he's really not that skeptical about a lot of things. He accepts a lot of Stoic ethics, accepts a lot of Aristotelian stuff, actually makes an argument at one point that is kind of implausible, that the Stoics on the one hand and the Platonists and Aristotelians on the other are really saying the same thing, just with different language. I don't think that's all that defensible, but he does try to claim that in Book 4. And then we have the Platonic tradition. Right? Plutarch is probably the most important of the Middle Platonists in that respect. Plutarch actually has a book on Stoic self-contradictions, where you'd expect to see some arguments. And then he's got other ones as well, like on the common notions against the Stoics. Right? So obviously he's going to be combating them. I think that there's a few things in Alcinous's Handbook of Platonism that make sense here. And then Alexander of Aphrodisias. And I should point out that in the latter two, the Stoics are not named as such. It's they say, those people say. But the only people who say those things that they're criticizing are the Stoics. Well, I guess you could also say Aristos, who the Stoics themselves criticize. And I guess maybe the Cynics might be interpreted as saying that, but it's really mostly the Stoics. And there are other people who criticize the Stoics. Plotinus criticizes the Stoics, but it's not really about the virtues as such. It's more metaphysical issues. Sextus Empiricus, against the ethicists, criticizes the Stoics and in some of his other works. But on virtue, not quite so much. So it's really, as far as I can tell, those four are the main ones that we want to look at. So what does Cicero say? In Book 3 of On the Ends, Cicero has Cato present the Stoic position, and then, like a good academic, he attacks it in Book 4. As a matter of fact, that's what's really cool about On the Ends, is first it's the Epicureans, and then critique of the Epicureans. Then the Stoics, critique of the Stoics. And then finally, Book 5 is the Aristotelian / Platonic position as Cicero is presenting it. So Cicero says, if you buy into this idea that all people's folly, injustice, and other vices are alike and all sins are equal, and that those who, by nature and training, have made considerable progress towards virtue, unless they've actually attained to it, are utterly miserable, and there's nothing whatever to choose between their existence and that of the wickedest of mankind, so that the great and famous Plato, supposing he was not a wise man, lived no better and no happier a life than any unprincipled scoundrel. And he takes that to be an absurdity, right? Obviously, Plato is better than some rum-dum off the street who's like, breaking into cars, stealing radios or something like that, right? Well, how is that the case then, given this Stoic view? He also attacks that whole outshines argument that we looked at. He says, with things so small as to be eclipsed from view, we are bound to admit it makes no difference to us whether we have them or not. On the other hand, with things that are not so completely eclipsed, it may nevertheless be the case that any difference they do make is not very great. Bodily goods resemble rather the latter sort of things. They contribute something, not a lot, but something. So if you're happy because you're virtuous, but you're also independently wealthy, that does make a little contribution. It's better than, it's sort of like what Aristotle said, right? You can have the virtues, but if you are destitute, you're not happy, right? The Stoics would say, no, you are happy, but you can be a little bit happier. Well, the Stoics wouldn't say that. Cicero would say that as a refutation. Another one that he says, Zeno himself maintains that Plato, if he's not wise, is not in the same case as the tyrant Dionysus. The guy who held Plato up, right? Dionysus, what's the difference? Dionysus has no hope of wisdom. He's never going to be any better. Whereas Plato can improve. So this is an argument against them. And then finally, he says that the Stoics bring forward what gets translated as extremely false analogies, similitudines dissimilus, right? So similarities that are not similar, likenings that are not alike. And he says that you infer that improvement and progress in virtue are of no avail to save a man from being entirely wretched until he's actually arrived at virtue. There's like a threshold that you have to cross. And he says, Cato, there's no analogy between progress and virtue in the cases you're describing, in which, however one advances, the situation one wishes to escape from remains the same until one has actually escaped from it. And he says, good analogies would be this instead. One's eyesight is dim, another's general health is weak. Apply remedies, and they get better day to day. So, think about this. You're all just blurs to me with this off. But I put this technology on, and now suddenly, I can see you. I know who I'm talking to Owen rather than some guy who wandered in off the street, right? Now, what if that was me training my eyeballs or something like that, doing eye exercises? Well, that would be like becoming virtuous, he says. Similarly, with all who earnestly pursue virtue, they get better. Their vices and errors are gradually reduced. So Cicero is saying, listen, your analogies, your arguments, they're not very good. We shouldn't buy into them. Plutarch, in a number of texts, is going to go after them. The first one I wanted to talk about is progress in virtue, right? He's actually got this, how a person may be aware of their progress in virtue. Now, if you can be aware of progress, there has to be some sort of like criterion for it, right? So he says, those who do not adjust their tenets to fit the facts, tois pragmasin, but rather try to force the facts into an unnatural agreement with their assumptions, have filled philosophy with a great number of difficulties, of which the greatest is that it would assign all human beings to a general category of badness, with the single exception of the absolutely perfect person, a result of which is to make a puzzle of what we call progress, prokope in Greek, right? Actually progressing towards how we ought to be. And he says it falls but little short of the uttermost foolishness, and it represents people who've been released by it from all sorts of passions and weaknesses as living in a state of equal wretchedness with those who have not yet been freed but from a single one of the evils. In the Stoic Contradictions, he says, they say that neither is a person perfect if he doesn't have all the virtues, nor a deed perfect which is not done in accordance with all the virtues. But in the sixth book of the Ethical Problems, Chrysippus says the decent person is not always being courageous, nor is he intemperate all the time either. They make conflicting statements when they say that he who has the virtues or vices acts in accordance with all of them at once, and that the decent person is not always being courageous and the base person cowardly. So that might be, you could probably argue your way out of that and say, well, you know, you don't always have to be using courage, right? But then he says something else that I think this is an uncommon conceptions. He says, since it is from the summit of progress that people change to happiness and virtue, one of two things must be true. Either progress is not a state of vice and unhappiness, or else virtue is not far removed from vice, nor is happiness from unhappiness. When the Stoics refuse to abandon any of the conflicting propositions, they've got a whole bunch of like things that they're buying into, right? But wish to assert and maintain all of them together, does it perhaps seem to you that they're in an amazing way confirming the consistency of their doctrines, and still more their deeds, when declaring that all who are not sages are in the same degree vicious and unjust and unreliable and foolish? They, then again, while avoiding and abominating some, to others entrust money or hand over offices and give their daughters in marriage. It is at odds with the common conceptions to deal with some people as tolerable and with others as extremely vicious, while subjecting all alike to blame and reproach. This is what we call a performative contradiction, right? So he's saying you've got all these things that you're committed to. You can't actually live this out. Your conduct shows that you don't really buy into this, or if you do buy into it, it's because you Stoics are unwise. You lack wisdom. A little bit later, he'll say, you know, with progress and virtue, one important indication of progress is that you no longer hold the opinion that any one of your errors is unimportant, but you're circumspect and heedful regarding all, right? You treat each thing as if it matters. And then on moral virtue, he says, if by positing all errors and faults are equal, they're in some other way overlooking the truth, this present discourse is not the proper occasion to confute them. But in the case of the emotions, right? So remember, virtue should be like a mean between the emotions from the later Platonist and the Aristotelian view. The Stoics appear to be in opposition to reason and contrary to plain evidence. For according to them, every emotion is an error, and everybody who grieves or fears or desires is guilty of error. There need to be some great differences in the emotions according to their greater or lesser intensity. Akata to malon kai to hechon, which he brings up at a number of points. It's often translated as degrees, right? There's degrees in virtue and vice. And so he's saying, listen, somebody could have the right amount of fear, and he's quite right, because the Stoics do think that you can have the right kind of fear. That's what caution, the good emotion, that is rational fear, does. So I think he's on point with that. Alcinous, taken by Dylan to be criticizing or opposing the Stoic view, he will say that there's imperfect and perfect virtues. And this is kind of interesting, because so Alcinous actually does agree that perfect virtues are not subject to higher and lower levels of intensity. So once you have, justice completely, you're completely just. And so that seems to be a bit different than like Plutarch, his fellow Middle Platonist. And that seems more like the Stoics. But then Alcinous, he's kind of trying to have it all. He says, vices exhibit both increase and decrease. One person can be more foolish or unjust than the other. So that's kind of an interesting, almost hybrid position. And then finally, Alexander of Aphrodisias, in Ethical Problems, is going to say, the just and the unjust person come to be either from the opposite or what is intermediate. They do not do so from the opposite. So the virtuous person doesn't come from the vicious person. So there must be some sort of intermediate between them, and the condition from which just and unjust people come to be is intermediate between them. The same argument applies to all virtue and wickedness. And then he's got a clincher. He says, they said, the Stoics, wickedness was in man's nature and all were born wicked. Well, then wickedness would be natural for us, right? But that of which the opposite is natural for something is itself unnatural for that. So justice and virtue would be unnatural for us human beings. The Stoics want to say, no, these virtues are like our realized human nature. So this is a pretty good argument right there. He also says that, this is in Ethical Problems 27, no one would say that a person who is on the way to virtue, a prokopton in Greek, is characterized by a combination of virtue and vice. It doesn't work quite like that. It's got to be a separate state. And then finally, on fate, according to them, virtue and vice are the only things that are in the one case good, in the other bad, and none of the other living creatures are able to admit of either. And of human beings, the greatest number are bad, or rather there are one or two whom they speak of having become good men, as in a fable, like the Ethiopian phoenix. All the rest are wicked, and so to an equal extent. So there's no difference between one and the other, and all who are not wise are alike mad. If this is so, how will the human being not be the most wretched creature of all, having wickedness and madness innate within them and allotted to them? I think that's a pretty good argument, right there. So, we could say, the Stoic official position, it's got some serious issues. Could it be saved at all against these sort of criticisms? So there's a couple ways, but saving it means modifying it to some degree. So Diogenes Laertes, he says something really interesting about Posidonius. And Posidonius, remember, is a kind of eclectic, less orthodox Stoic. It's criticized by the stick-in-the-mud orthodox Stoics of his time, unnamed people. So Posidonius says the proof, the tekmerion, right, the decisive proof that virtue really exists is that Socrates, Diogenes, and Antisthenes made moral progress. So he doesn't point to their virtue. He points to the fact that they themselves made progress towards virtue. Cicero, in On the Ends, Book 3, he gives us something kind of interesting from Cato. The Stoics deny virtues or vices can be increased in degree, crescere in Latin, right? But they do believe that each of them can be, in a sense, expanded and widened in scope. Fundi quodam modo et quasi dilatari, right? So you can say, well, what the hell's the difference there, Well, presumably, so you can't become more virtuous in any substantive sense, but the virtue could be better applied or more widely applied or something like that. Seneca says in Letter 66, there's many aspects to virtue. They unfold themselves as life varies and as actions differ. But virtue itself does not become less or greater. Virtue is not changed by the matter. But if the matter is hard and stubborn, it doesn't make the virtue worse. If pleasant and joyous, it doesn't make it better. Also in the same letter, he says, there are going to be great differences according as the material varies, as it becomes now broader, now narrower, now glorious, dealing with wonderful things, maybe like a commonwealth, now base balancing your checking account or something like that, right? Manifold in scope and now limited. So, okay, maybe there's something to this, right? Cicero will also talk about a 5-part development. He's got like a schema that Cato presents, where we first start with like preserving ourselves in our being and our natural constitution, and then we start, retaining some things in accordance with nature and repelling other things. And then third, we start to make proper choices conditioned by what we translate as duties or appropriate action, cum officio selectio. And then finally that choice becomes a fixed habit, perpetua. And then all of that is sort of preparatory. Finally, we get to the point where these choices become fully rationalized, constans, and in harmony with nature. And he says, here the good properly so called arises and comes to be understood. So that there we become virtuous. This is how progress works in one account. And Seneca has a good thing to say too. And Seneca is kind of... he wants to be a good Orthodox Stoic in this respect, but he also seems to, at some points, need to modify it. So in letter 75, he says, are there no degrees of happiness below your happy man? Is there a sheer descent, right? So you're not virtuous, boom, you're at the bottom. And he says, no. He who makes progress is still numbered with fools, so he's vicious, right? But he's separated from them by a long interval. Among the very persons who are making progress, there are great spaces, great intervals intervening. They fall into 3 classes. And so the bottom class are people who are beyond the reach of many of the vices, particularly the great ones, but not beyond the reach of all. And he says not even these are to be despised, like the fools are to be despised, right? So that would be, those of us who lose our temper still, or aren't generous or beneficent when we should be, or are tempted to be unjust, and every once in a while we cheat on our taxes or something like that, tell little lies, right? And then he says, second, those who've laid aside the greatest ills of the mind and its passions, but are not in assured possession of immunity. They can backslide. So this would be sort of like the Aristotelian encratic person, wouldn't it? They get things right most of the time. They still got to force themselves to do the right thing. And if they slack off, they're probably going to go back down, right? And then the first, just below virtue, those who've not attained wisdom, but who have attained a place nearby. People who've laid aside all their passions and vices and learned what things are to be embraced, but their assurance is not yet tested. So they're close, but they're not all the way in virtue. Seneca seems to think that, he does say they're all still, to be numbered among the fools, but they're not foolish fools, right? I don't know. We use this sophomore, right? The wise fool in college things. Epictetus is a very different, interesting kind of Stoic. I call him a conservative innovator, because he is, in some respects, more conservative than Seneca or Marcus Aurelius, but he also brings in lots of Aristotelian stuff, and he originates other ideas in Stoic philosophy. For example, bringing in the term proiresis, which, it's found in other places, right? But it's mostly an Aristotelian idea, and he reworks it into making it a absolutely central part of Stoic philosophy. And Epictetus doesn't talk about virtue much. So he's different than the other Stoics in that respect. In 2.9, he says, philosophers admonish us not to be satisfied with merely learning, but to add practice and training. For who is there among us that cannot give a philosophical discourse about good and evil? Meaning, we all know the story, we all know the party line. He says, it will run like this. Of things that are, some are good, some are evil, others indifferent. Now good things are virtues and everything that partakes in the virtues. Evil are the opposite. Well, indifferent are wealth, health, and reputation. And then he says, now if somebody interrupts us in the middle of this, or laughs, or there's a loud noise, suddenly we don't know what we're talking about anymore, right? Because what we have to do is actually practice. We have to make this part of ourselves. So how do we do that? He's got a chapter called On Progress, Peri Prokopes. He says, if it is virtue that holds out the promise to create happiness and calm and serenity, assuredly, progress towards virtue is progress towards each of these states in mind. How comes it that we acknowledge virtue to be a thing of this sort and yet seek progress and make a display of it in other things? Progress isn't being able to read Chrysippus. He talks about that at a number of points. Oh, you can rattle off the stuff, but you don't actually follow the teachings. He says, are you not willing to show him the work of virtue so that he may learn where to look for his progress? Look for it where your work lies. Where does your work lie? And here he says three things: in desire and aversion, in choice and refusal, and in giving assent giving and withholding assent of judgment. Now these are what he talks about in another chapter, 3.2, the three fields, the three topoi of Stoic philosophy, which don't show up in anybody else's Stoic philosophy, just in Epictetus, right? So where is he getting this from? Oh, we don't know. We're not sure at all. Seneca does talk about three fields, but they're not the same three fields in one of his letters. But what are these three fields? Well, desire and aversion, right? The discipline of desire, choice and refusal, which is covering action, the discipline of action, and then the discipline of assent. So he says you got to get those things right, and then you're actually going to be virtuous. And then he talks about. Of these three, the third belongs only to those who are making progress. He uses this word progress all the time. Epictetus is hammering away on this. In 2.3, he talks about the central importance of proiresis. He says, what is by its very nature capable of hindering proiresis? Nothing that lies outside its sphere, only itself when it's perverted. Through this, it becomes, and these are the words that he's using, the only vice, the only virtue. So our proiresis, our faculty of choice, which is self-determining and free, that is where virtue and vice lie for Epictetus. That literally is the only virtue and vice. And he says, that doesn't mean that we have to despise the other faculties. Does a person say there's no use or advancement except in the proiresis? No, he's just assigning its true value to each thing. And then the other thing that Epictetus brings up that I think is helping out here, habit is absolutely important, right? He talks about that all the time. He gives you clear advice about how to change our habits, how to understand our habits. That only makes sense if we have a substantive concept of making progress. Now, could we understand this as like virtue is like a threshold and you have to make a certain amount of progress before you can actually get there and then cross that threshold? I think that's fine. That works. But the idea that, nobody, except for the sage, nobody is virtuous, although that is a, traditional Stoic idea, seems like a non-starter, And so we've got a couple different options in the present, and then, here's where we'll wrap up and, maybe have a little conversation. You could stick with the official problematic position. I don't know why the hell you would want to. There may be aspects of it that are worth preserving, but as a whole, it doesn't seem to be particularly useful. And I think of most contemporary Stoics like Long. Well, Long actually says that he's not a Stoic. He's an Epicurean at some times and a skeptic at some times and a Stoic at other times. But Becker and people like that say that it's very important to stress the importance of progress and to not discourage people by saying you can't ever be virtuous. The other thing we could do would be to try to shoehorn Stoic philosophy into a more generic, more or less neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics. I think that's kind of a non-starter too. Why do Stoic ethics if it's exactly the same as Aristotelian ethics? Why not just do the Aristotelian ethics, right? Or do the debased forms that we find in popular presentations of virtue ethics that like make anything they want into a virtue, right? So long as it's in between. Even that doesn't even fit Aristotle's notion of things. But I think we could have a good happy medium. So maybe there is a mean here, some sort of thought through, possibly semi-eclectic perspective that recognizes that there has to be progress towards virtue. And if we don't want to say that it's like a middle state where you got vice here and then virtue here and then this middle state of progress, maybe we do have to have something like a threshold account, but maybe the threshold has to be way closer than this unattainable sage idea that was being pushed, And we probably need some recognition, I think, of improvement in virtue once we're actually virtuous, right? So if that means abandoning the official Stoic position, I would say that, Epictetus and Seneca, maybe they're good models for that. It certainly seemed to be something that Posidonius and Panaetius were, at least receptive to. So I don't think that this is anti-Stoic or abandoning Stoicism as such. But, and here's where I'll close, if there's going to be a robust Stoic virtue ethics as a rival tradition to Aristotelian virtue ethics in the present, as Long is suggesting in his article, which I think is a great prospect, it's going to have to be a lot more flexible when it comes to these understandings of virtue. And that means that there may, in fact, have to be a mean smuggled back in some respect. So that's all that I've got so far. I know I've talked for quite a while, and it may be, to the point where people have forgotten what was originally said, but I'm happy to take any questions or comments or... thanks.
So we have a couple. We do not, as usual, have the online presence hooked up and projected. So Martin, if you have any questions, just chime in. Otherwise, we won't be seeing you.
We're jury rigging it.
But TJ, do you have anything, or otherwise?
I think are you muted or?
Does have a question?
Yeah, I'm not hearing anything though.
I said.
Oh, there we go.
We'll just a question about give others a chance first.
Okay. Do you guys have any questions, or? I mean, I cover this is kind of a wide sweep through the history of moral philosophy, but yeah, go ahead on.
Well, so I'm going to try to bring them together, the Aristotelian and the Stoic ideas together.
Yeah.
Aristotle says there's no mean of an extreme.
Right.
You can't be an adulterer in the right way. With the right woman at the right time, not too often, maybe every other conference I go to, whatever. That doesn't work.
Yeah.
Likewise, there's no mean for a virtue. You can't be, it makes no sense to say he's too just. Or you don't want to be too just, you don't want to be not just enough. So by definition, the middle point is somehow unique.
Yeah.
But Aristotle stresses that it's not a matter of precision. It's not a matter of mathematical precision.
Yeah.
So let's think of a rather trivial example concerning an indifference, which would be ice cream.
Okay.
I'm at someone's house, and they offer me ice cream. Taking no ice cream would be rude. Taking 2 scoops of ice cream is too many.
Yeah.
So taking 1 scoop of ice cream would be, for Aristotle, the virtuous.
Yeah.
That would seem to be in line with a Stoic account, according to which the sage makes choices in accordance with nature.
Yeah.
And nature is, as it were, if you are a sage, then the presentation or the fantasia of 1 scoop shows itself as appropriate. 2 scoops is too many, 0 scoops too little.
Yeah.
So even though being a sage itself is not a matter of it is not a matter of a mean between extremes.
Yeah.
The sage will choose the mean between two extremes because
I think that's right.
surely
Yeah.
the Stoics would agree that the appropriate choice that's in accordance with nature is in many cases somewhere between too much and too little.
Yeah.
What I'm missing from the Stoics, and you can correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah.
is Aristotle wants to say, there's vagueness. How big is the one scoop?
Yeah.
Is it a little bit bigger than the ice cream scoop? A little bit smaller? A tablespoon and a half?
Is it big enough?
Come on,
Is
give
it
me
big
a
enough that
break.
it could count as two
There is some
scoops?
mathematical precision.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Stoics seem not want to say, if it's a matter of choice, then there is a correct choice. So if you're choosing between using that ice cream scoop and that one, there is a correct choice there. And if you mess up, it's the wrong answer.
I mean,
But they have the mean somehow
Yeah.
implicit in this idea of choosing in the context of a world that gives you all kinds of shades of gray. So I'm not sure that the difference is as stark as they rhetorically make it out to be.
Yeah, and I'm sympathetic to that. I mean, the Stoics do say some weird stuff about the sage. Like, he never screws up,
Right.
And not only does he have all these virtues, he's also like, the best in everything. He's dialectical, he's erotic, he's the best lover. I mean, you read that and you're like, where the hell did they get these ideas from? And why would intelligent people, because they see a lot of the other stuff they say is very, persuasive and intelligent. You're like, why the hell would they insist on this? And I don't have a good answer for that. As to like in real life situations, there will be choices. I think you're right. Justice is going to require you to take the right amount of ice cream or you're staying at the place and do you insist on the couch or the guest bedroom or things, all these trivial things, right, that the Stoics call indifference. They are measured, and prudence would bear on those as well, and I think temperance definitely would, right? How much ice cream should I have? Well, maybe there's plenty of ice cream to be had, so each of us could have a gallon, but that's not good for me, something like that. So I think you're right about that. Another thing, too, where I think the Stoics and the Aristotelians are not that different from each other. So the Aristotelian mean isn't just an arithmetic thing, as you're saying, and there is vagueness to it, but there's also all these rights to it. Right person, right time. Right amount is only one of the host day, or how things ought to be. There's the right manner and all these other things. And I think what determines that, well, right reason, Aristotle says, right? So the Stoics say something similar. Orthos logos is doing the decision. And it strikes me that the Stoics are unfair to the Aristotelians a lot of the time. Maybe polemically so. Maybe to make themselves look better or make their own position look more plausible. But I don't see them as that opposed to each other when it comes to practice, like you're talking about. It's more of a theoretical position that why the hell do they need to insist on it so much? I guess they really want to stress that even if we are improving, we're still not where we ought to be. But Aristotle could say that too, right? Or Plato could say that too, couldn't he?
If I could have a follow-up.
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
The Stoic position reminds me of ethical views that bring in the divine as a moral touchstone. And here I'm thinking of two different things.
Yeah.
If you think about Plato in the Phaedo, and of course the Neoplatonists are going to run with this.
Yeah.
Philosophical virtue involves a kind of purification
Becoming like
and
God.
assimilation to eternal perfection.
Yeah.
Well, if that's your standard, just the smallest tinge of impurity means that it's not pure.
Yeah.
It's an all or nothing thing.
Yeah.
Yes, there are stages of some things are more impure than others. But if my water has the smallest drop of salt, the tiniest particle of salt.
Yeah.
It's not pure H2O. If my soul has the slightest tinge
Stain of sin.
of connection or longing for the material,
Yeah.
I'm not where I need to be. And then I think about the Hasidic religious tradition that I have an association with, where there are three kinds of people. There's the tzaddik, who is the holy person. There's the Benoni, who's in between, and there's the Rasha, who's the wicked. And the tzaddik, like the Stoic sage, never messes up.
Yeah.
And is a total moral exemplar. And I've got my problems with identifying this person or that person as a tzaddik.
Yeah.
But existentially, it makes sense, because what does that mean? It means I'm not it. I've got work to do. Even though I'm not as bad as, this or that person over there, as long as you know that you're not where you need to be, existentially, there's work to do. And that's an important lesson to say, I'm a pretty good guy. I'm doing all right.
It might provoke progress, right?
Then that will make me lazy. Maybe that's part of the appeal of the counterintuitive Stoic position. You're not there yet, Greg. Neither am I.
Yeah.
Don't rest on your laurels. And so that seems to be part of what Socrates is exhorting us to do in the Phaedo as well. We're not there. We have work to do. We need to keep trying to become more philosophical.
Yeah.
By setting up this, likewise Neil did this, by setting up this impractical ideal of total purity and assimilation to the one, it shows us that we're not there.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean we're horrible people, and we need to beat ourselves up.
And that's it, if it is an ideal,
But at least we can't get too comfortable. And so now the Stoics use the rhetoric of "you're wicked," and because you're not there, and that might be, I agree with you, that can be psychologically unhelpful. Because in that case, why do I even bother?
It's interesting, because one of the reasons that I got drawn to this in the first place had to do with Anselm. Because Anselm also has an ethics where there's virtues, and the virtues don't have a mean in between, virtue and vice. You're either virtuous or you're vicious, in a very sort of Stoic tinged manner. And you look at Anselm himself, and he was a really good guy, And then you read his prayers and his meditations, and he's like, "Oh, I'm so sinful, John the Baptist, can't you help me out? Intercede for me, because I'm just a worm, And you're like, is he like, doing false humility here? And I thought about this for a while, and I talked about this with some Benedictines who thought about this for much longer than I had, and they're like, no, it's not false humility. The closer you get to God, the more you realize all these places where what you thought you had figured out and you were good, there's all these pockets of crap that have to be fixed, right? And in a certain way, so if this thing is an ideal, it works much better for people that have actually advanced quite a way, because they're emotionally mature enough to handle the fact that they are still wicked in some sense, although not as bad as those people over there, right? Whereas if you were to take somebody off the street and you're like, all right, we're doing Stoicism today. Here, let me put it all on the board, By the way, you are as bad as the worst person ever. They'd be like, oh man, this is not helpful for me at all. Now I feel depressed, This doesn't conduce to me making progress, right? So maybe you have to be a certain advancement along before that could be a helpful ideal. I mean, it's funny because Cicero takes the Stoics to task over and over again in his works, and he likes the Stoics, but he's like, you people really need to study rhetoric because you do a terrible job in presenting your doctrines. And I think he's completely right about that. You make things more difficult, not more complicated, but more difficult than they need to be for people, to buy into. So yeah, I think that's probably right. Yeah, I mean, one thing that isn't there in all this discussion that is there in the Platonic tradition is that, like, we're going to be like the gods, and the Stoics. I mean, they talk about a commonwealth of gods and human beings, but we don't ever become like the gods.
But if you're following nature, you're following Zeus.
Yeah,
and
you're following capital.
And the logos, the big logos,
Yeah.
that is God.
That's true.
Is your logos, and they're totally in sync. Right?
Yeah, but you're going to die, and you're. I mean, the Stoics are materialists. Yeah. I mean, Seneca hedges back and forth. Maybe the soul goes up in the stars or something like that. But I don't think he really. That's in Letters of Consolation. I don't think he really buys that. It's more like the Aristotelians or the Epicureans. You're dead. That's it. Whereas with the Platonic tradition, well, you've got this great possibility of, like, living on, and your soul gets purified, and you survive, right? As a good person, and you get to be, like in the Phaedrus, friends with the gods, right? So yeah, that's. I think I took us kind of far afield. Did you have any questions, or?
I did. So, do the Stoics have a position on, like, if a kid is born?
Yeah.
Are they? Because we discussed previously that both there is a innate nature to some of the pillars of being virtuous, but there's also an innate nature to being wicked. So, is there, like, if a child is born, what's the story there?
They're kind of all over the map.
Okay.
Right? So Cicero, in the account that Cato presents, is, you could say, one tradition in this where there's actually like two tiers. There's the stuff that's according to nature, but even that isn't yet virtue. We have these primary impulses of nature, and they begin with childhood, right? Yeah. We have and this is often framed in terms of oikeiosis, the making things our own. So you see this discussed by other Stoic philosophers as well, like Heracles. So the idea is you get to a certain point, and then suddenly you start recognizing something that's higher than just our regular nature, and you come to see that virtue is good for its own sake, right? There's other accounts where, I mean, they have the problem of evil, right? If our nature is good, how the hell did we get so screwed up, right? And so they've got, like, answers that are plausible, like, well, we're not fully rational, and we find the lures of pleasure as infants and get drawn into stuff, and then we have all these stupid adults who are giving us bad examples, like telling us you should be pursuing wealth and honors and stuff like that. And the people who talk about that sort of thing, I think Seneca talks about this. It's sort of like, well, no matter where you're born, you're probably going to have a bunch of stupid family members that are messing you up. And you could think now there was Zeno wrote a Republic, right? Yeah. And there were a few other political writings where it's kind of utopian. We don't really know much about them. We know more from, like, detractors saying, "Oh, they were for cannibalism," or things like that, than we do specifically. But presumably, if you were lucky enough to be born into a household of practicing Stoics who are like the real deal, not just memorizing Chrysippus or something, but living it out, then as a little baby, you could have, like, the right kind of formation, and they could nip all the crap in the bud that doesn't make us like what we are.
Yeah. So I really am short on time. But
yeah.
Something odd that occurred to me is if you can make choices that are virtuous choices, you can make choices that are vicious choices.
Yeah.
But they're also indifferent choices. So theoretically,
you
could live your life only picking indifferent choices.
No, I don't think the Stoics would say you could, because you can't avoid being in situations where you do have to pick between what's virtuous or vicious.
Okay.
I mean, the things that they count as indifference, there are some things that they say are, like, totally indifferent, like the number of stars in the sky or the number of hairs on your head. Is it odd or even? It's one of those, like, who cares, right?
But
so
in reference to the question of ice cream,
Yeah.
there is a virtuous choice,
Yeah.
even if it is, a relatively minor.
Exactly.
question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whether it's strawberry or vanilla, knock yourself out. 3 scoops or 8 scoops.
Yeah.
They're
Is a vicious
Too much,
and you
yeah.
have to choose.
Yes.
You can't just avoid it.
Yes. Because the not choosing something is itself a decision.
I mean, why couldn't you say to the host, you decide how many scoops I'm going to have. I'll leave it up to you, and then you pass the buck on. Wouldn't that be possible?
Maybe you don't. Sometimes hosts want to be more gracious than is good for them.
Oh, so then they give you 2 scoops and really show
I'll
off.
give you the shirt off my back.
But
Yeah,
that's
a good one.
vicious? You're not making a vicious choice.
I mean, here's where, again, the Stoic position, right? All bads are equally bad. I mean, I think all of us would be like, it's just an ice cream. I mean, it does have to do with, the virtue of hospitality and being a good guest and things like that, but it's pretty minor. It's not like walking in with oil on your boots and, walking into somebody's plush carpet and then wiping them on there. That's more vicious.
You're staying at a friend's house.
Yeah.
And you can't just say, you decide how long I'm going to stay. At some point, you're making them either kick you out, after you think, I would say you're welcome. I mean,
That's a good one. Yeah, I like that. We had a question though.
Yeah, Martin?
Yeah.
You raised so many questions. Owen's second question, that part of one of the things I was going to ask about. But another thing is, I find it very hard to make sense of these arguments without knowing more specifically what virtue consists in. I mean, at the beginning you said you want to avoid that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I mean, for example, I'll just use one aspect of this. In your quote from Seneca Letter 74, you talk about sometimes virtue is widespread, governing kingdoms, cities, provinces, creating laws, developing friendships, and regulating duties that hold between relatives and children, etc. Okay, it makes it sound like a lot of people can be virtuous. On the other hand, then you have this other extreme in which it sounds like virtue is just about impossible, if indeed it's ever been found.
Yeah.
Have there been? How many sages have there ever been, etc.?
Yeah.
So a lot of you're trying to understand this depends on actually knowing what virtue consists in. You can't. It's very hard to do it to make sense of it. These arguments without getting into that.
Well, I mean, that's where the other things in Stoic texts would be useful. I mean, Aristotelian gives a whole breakdown of the Stoic virtues. Seneca does it at a number of different points. I mean, they're the 4 cardinal virtues, right? And they'll talk quite a bit about what's required in this kind of situation, what's involved in this sort of situation. Cicero's on duties too. Book 1 is a breakdown of the Stoic virtues because he's basically copying Panaetius's on duties as well. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to that passage, Seneca's point is not to try to tell us precisely what virtue is there. He's trying to say, listen, virtue can be extended to all sorts of things if anybody happens to be virtuous,
But is virtue the same thing in all these cases? Is there a difference, for example, comparable to Aristotle's difference between moral virtue and intellectual virtue?
Oh, okay, yeah. So the Stoics don't recognize that difference, right? And even with Aristotle, it's kind of unclear whether prudence really is just an intellectual virtue because it's so tied in with the moral virtues. So, I mean, they do have, again, in Aristotelis, the Stoics will talk, and also in Diogenes, they will talk about other things that are virtues but not moral virtues, like dialectic is a virtue, right? But we don't actually have enough of what they say to figure out what precisely they're talking about there compared to the moral virtues. But I think, between Seneca and these summaries of Stoic doctrine, we get a pretty robust conception of what each of those virtues, wisdom, justice, temperance, courage, does consist in. They don't look. I mean, with Seneca, you do get a little bit of semi-Aristotelian. It's not foolhardy. It's not cowardly. It's right in the right amount. And then there's lots of examples that they'll give too.
Well, the problem with that, I mean, I'm familiar with some of those things. The problem is whether they lead you to the point of saying that it's all or nothing. The way they.
Oh, those don't. Those discussions of the virtues don't lead you to that. That's a separate doctrine.
But that's the problem, because then it's hard to make sense to begin with the notion that it's all or nothing.
I don't see the incompatibility there. I think that you're seeing. I just don't buy that they're all or nothing. I find the other arguments that this can't really be the case, that there's like this dividing line, and you're either on this side or this side, and it's like, moral progress doesn't really mean anything. That can't possibly be right.
I'm insisting on that.
What's that?
On that absolutism.
Say that again?
They do spend a lot of time.
Yeah, and you wonder why, in some cases. But again, this is where we're kind of handicapped. I mean, if we could have Chrysippus's ethical problems, we might resolve a lot of this stuff. We might be, this is exactly what they were referring to, but all we've got are these little citations. Again, I mean, I doubt that we're going to get anything out of Herculaneum that pertains to Stoic stuff, but we can hope, Zeno had Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus get brought up all the time, and each of them wrote a lot of things having to do specifically with these moral doctrines, and we just don't have more than fragments, unfortunately. So yeah. Oh, we're getting probably close to time. Yeah.
So thank you for stopping.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
And thank you very much, Greg. And this will be both on our Midwest Seminar page and on YouTube, I would presume.